Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Driving Dealership Value, Preparing for a Sale or Future Growth. I'm Kathy, I'm the organizer for today's session, and I'm super excited to have you guys all here. For anyone who's new to us, at Rosenfield Co, we're a CPA firm with a strong focus on the automotive industry. We're more than just accountants, we're advisors to help dealers navigate challenges, seize opportunities, and build stronger and more resilient businesses. Each month we host these webinars. We bring together experts and thought leaders across the industry, and our goal is to create conversations that deliver real practical takeaways that you can apply to your dealership. So today we're diving into a really important topic for dealers, understanding what drives your value, preparing for a sale. Our speakers will share key insights on blue sky multiples, timing, and practical steps to improve a value before sale. We're joined by Gabe Robleto from Kerrigan Advisors, one of the leading voices in dealership buy-sell advisory. And we have our very own Paul Dumm, leader of business advisory services here at Rosenfield, who brings extensive experience in valuation and financial analysis. And to guide our discussion, we have Alicia Webb as our moderator. Just a quick reminder before we get started, this is an open conversation, so please use the Q&A chat feature throughout the session. And with that, Alicia, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Kathy. So, in our conversation before the webinar started, I learned actually quite a bit more about blue sky and how Kerrigan Advisors looks at all of this. So I'm really excited for this presentation. And also, Paul has some more nitty-gritty accounting tips for you that we're going to add to the written version of this, which I'll write up after this. So be sure to read that to learn even more. And without further ado, I will pass it over to you, Gabe. Or is it Paul? Yeah, Gabe's in control. Paul is going to talk now. Over to you, Paul.
Okay. All right. Yeah, so first off, I want, I think probably as everybody is aware, the value of anything is a function of, or any business, whether it's a dealership, a restaurant, whatever it may be, is based on expectations for three things: the profitability of that operation, the growth expectation for that operation, and the risk in that operation, and the risk of meeting or not meeting those profitability and growth expectations. In the auto world, or automotive dealership world, that kind of gets boiled down into a calculation involving the blue sky multiple. So when you talk about a value of a dealership, you have the value of the tangible assets that you're selling that might be negotiated as part of the sale, plus the blue sky, the intangible value of that dealership. And that's based on some expectation of economic benefit times this multiple. The rest of this discussion is going to be to talk about that multiple, what drives it, what the current trends are and things like that. And Gabe is going to lead that discussion, so I will turn it over to him.
Thank you so much, Paul and Alicia. Kathy, great to be here this afternoon. Thanks for having me on the webinar. So first off, I think it's important to discuss really how to adjust blue sky multiples. Many are familiar with our blue sky report that we release on a quarterly basis and publish multiples on a franchise by franchise basis. But I think the first question is, how will these multiples be adjusted and what should we apply them to? So to be clear, our multiples should be applied to the most recent adjusted earnings of a franchise, removing expenses a buyer will not incur and adding back expenses they will. Most buyers are pricing based on trailing 12 months performance, not the last 3 years average, not the last 5 years average, not 2019, an average of 25. It is, again, the most recent trailing 12 months performance. Now, that being said, multiples can go up and down significantly based on 7 key factors that we publish that do take into account pro forma situations. The first one being earnings growth expectations. So for a dealership that's far underperforming, a multiple can be much higher than our published figures. If a buyer expects to significantly increase earnings post-transaction. In this regard, underperforming dealerships often trade at a higher multiple of current earnings. The next one is geography. Dealerships in high demand markets such as Florida often trade for a significant premium to our published multiples. The location alone is driving the value here, not necessarily the franchise. And likewise, franchises in lower demand markets trade at lower multiples. Perhaps the best example of this factor was the impact that the CARB legislation had on blue sky multiples in CARB states. As you can see on this chart, demand for CARB franchises declined significantly over the last 3 years, resulting in a discounted multiple for franchises in these markets and much less buy-sell activity. Fortunately, on June 12th of this year, the U.S. Congress revoked the California Air Resources Board's authority to mandate EV sales, resulting in a pickup of buy sells in these markets and an improvement in blue sky multiples. The next driver is real estate. A valuation trend we discuss often, including in our upcoming report, which will be released next week, is real estate. We find that buyers are placing a much larger discount on dealerships that are not image compliant, mostly due to the concern that construction costs continue to be much higher than expected, particularly as tariffs get implemented, driving up cost. Just this year, the cost of metals for construction alone increased 25%. Kerrigan Advisors also comes out with a dealer survey every year. We have not yet released a 2025 survey that will be released at the beginning of the year. In our 24 survey, 48% of dealers believe that real estate investments cause dealership earnings to decline. Thus, it's not surprising that image requirements are causing steeper discounts in blue sky, particularly when considering the operational and correlated earnings disruption during the construction period. This will only get worse with all of the new image announcements recently, including a program for Chevrolet, GMC, Subaru, Toyota, and Ford, as well as the recent Honda program that was announced. The next driver valuation is market vehicle preference. So that's number 4 here on the screen. This is simply to say that truck franchises in truck markets like Texas will trade at a higher multiple than truck franchises in city metros. We recently sold Bucklew Chevrolet in Conroe, Texas, the ultimate truck market, and buyers were willing to pay a premium for this franchise as a result. The fifth driver, let's see, I got to go backwards. There we go. The sixth driver is customer relations. Customer relations, if a seller has a great reputation or a brand, that can drive the multiple higher. That was certainly the case in Koons. Our firm represented Koons in the Washington, D.C. metro, and that brand value was so significant that buyers were willing to pay a premium for that name in the marketplace. Lastly, revenue mix can have a big impact on a multiple. If a dealership has very strong fixed operations, service absorption north of 100% or close to 100%, that franchise will trade at a premium since its earnings are less exposed to the cyclicality of the new car market. Taking all these factors into account can result in a multiple far above our published multiples, as well as below. As I always like to say, there is more art than science that goes into valuation, and at the end of the day, A franchise is only worth what a buyer is willing and able to pay and what a seller is willing and able to accept. The good news is that in today's market, we are seeing far more buyers and sellers agreeing on numbers now that earnings have normalized and are starting to track upward. Alicia, I see you have a question.
Yes, you mentioned that, for instance, Kunz, that name has a lot of value. So, when Lithia, is it Lithia? When they acquire a
Asbury.
group, Asbury, they often keep the name. I know, but they often keep the name that's attached to it. Others will change the name. So, does a dealership suddenly lose value if you buy a dealership there's a lot of brand equity in the name and then you change the name?
So that decision is very personal to the seller. Sometimes it is their own family name and they feel that they are going to take that with them when they exit. So in the example of Coons, that was a very valuable piece of the equation in the marketplace, and then the buyer wanted to retain that name. And in other examples, the first thing a seller wants to do is a buyer wants to do is change the name because they do want a fresh start. They want to tell the world we're under new management. In other cases, they don't want to tell the world we're under new management. They want to say, hey, nothing's changed. We're still this great, wonderful dealer group, and we're going to continue on. So it's highly dependent, Alicia, but does have something to do whether how much value really is there in that name, or is it actually a detractor, and you want to put a new name on it.
Cool, thank you.
So next, I think it'd be helpful to go over some of our recent changes in the last quarter, Blue Sky report. Specifically, we've increased the Blue Sky multiple for 3 domestic franchises, Ford, Chevrolet, and Buick GMC. Ford's aggressive sales incentives are bringing customers back to the brand, growing its market share, and differentiating the company from its mass market peers, resulting in a recent upgrade. Like Ford, Chevrolet, and Buick GMC are also benefiting from General Motors' position as one of the OEMs least impacted by tariffs. Chevrolet and GMC saw the highest sales growth in the non-luxury segment, driving strong buyer demand for the franchise and ultimately an upgrade by our firm to their multiples. Unfortunately, in the second quarter, we also downgraded one non-luxury multiple, specifically Volkswagen. The brand continues to see sales declines in the US and globally due to a rapid contraction in market share in China and the company's significant exposure to US tariff policy, resulting in a significant decline in buyer demand for the franchise. Assessing these multiples as compared to their average sales per franchise, we can see the critical importance of a right-sized dealer network to drive Blue Sky value. When OEMs have a higher average sales per franchise, they also have higher UIOs per dealerships, and thus more consistent profitability as the earnings are less reliant on cyclical new car sales. In this regard, Toyota and Honda stand in a league of their own. Honda has notably improved this metric since its pandemic-era supply-side challenges were overcome, resulting in an increase in buyer demand for the franchise and a potential improvement in Blue Sky multiple in 2026. Now, while the franchises on the left-hand side of the graph can often be highly profitable, we find the drivers of that profitability are usually the operator or the location rather than just the franchise. Therefore, the multiple is lower. Turning to the luxury segment, in light of General Motors' improvement we discussed, we've also upgraded the multiple outlook for Cadillac in our third quarter report. Cadillac sales increased 19% through the third quarter, and their day supply is below industry average, a huge turnaround from prior years. We expect Cadillac to see its Blue Sky multiples increase in the fourth quarter. In the second quarter, we reduced Volvo's Blue Sky multiple. The OEM owned by China's Geely Holdings is one of the most exposed automakers to rising tariffs, with the majority of its vehicles produced outside of the United States, and dealer sentiment is very low in 2025. We also downgraded Audi multiple. The franchise continues to see market contraction, and a rising share of its dealers are dissatisfied with the OEM, resulting in lower buyer demand. We're also aware of several Audi franchises losing money in 2025. So in addition to these changes, we are monitoring two franchises for potential upgrades, specifically Land Rover and Lexus. Land Rover sales increased an impressive 23% through the third quarter of 25. The company did suffer a debilitating cyber attack in October 31st, halting vehicle production potentially for the remainder of the year. However, despite that, dealers report that the current limited supply of vehicles on the ground is sufficient to support sales for the remainder of the year and will likely result in stronger gross profits as supply becomes more constrained before production ramps up. So we expect rising buyer demand could result in an increase in JLR's multiple in 2026. In addition to JLR, Lexus continues to hit on all cylinders. The OEM reported record dealer profitability in 2025, impressively surpassing COVID-era earnings. So demand for Lexus franchises is surging as every major consolidator seeks to add it to their portfolio. Given the limited supply of the franchise and the growing demand, Kerrigan Advisors expects Lexus low-end multiple will likely increase in 2026, and our outlook remains very positive. This next chart shows the high sales per franchise on the luxury segment. Similar to non-luxury segment, the biggest driver of luxury blue sky franchises is sales per franchise. Again, Lexus stands in a category of its own on the right-hand side of the chart. The one major outlier to this correlation is Porsche, which makes up for its lower sales per franchise by its high margins per vehicle sold. That said, this has been a much harder year for Porsche, given its faltering EV strategy, and some buyers have reacted quite negatively to its very expensive Gen 5 building requirements. We also want to note that while luxury sales were weaker in the first 9 months of the year, they have significant potential to rebound when considering just the strength of luxury consumers' balance sheets. The top 10% of earners have maintained their excess savings since the pandemic, while the remainder of the population has spent much of what was accumulated. Also, these top 10 percenters represent 50% of US consumer spending and continue to demonstrate their willingness to keep spending, which is evidenced in the strength of the ultra luxury market. We are also seeing a rise in buy sells. We do expect that the extension of the Trump tax cuts, along with the rising stock market, will be an additional boost to these very wealthy consumers who may feel more bullish on luxury purchases, driving sales higher going forward, particularly as more supply becomes available. Clearly, the publics are seeing that in a way they've given their luxury acquisition bias in 25. That concludes my prepared remarks on the drivers of what drives the multiple higher or lower, as well as a preview on which franchises are in higher demand and in lower demand. Certainly, before turning it over to Paul, Alicia, is there any specific questions you'd like to go over?
I don't have any, but does anybody else have a question now? You can save it for the end, or please speak up. We love questions from our participants. No? Well, I guess we'll pass it over to Paul, and then I'm sure I'll have some questions after Paul.
Great. Okay. Going back to the first slide that was presented, don't physically go back, but you remember I said that the value is based on three drivers: profitability, growth, and risk. And when you look at those 7 factors that Gabe talked about, you can align all 7 of those with one of with growth, profitability, and risk. Like when you're talking about the condition of the facilities, for example, that might be it. That's a profitability issue. There's going to have to be money spent to become image compliant if you want to affect that multiple. Also, it's a function of risk too. Your location is a function of risk. Gabe had indicated, if you're not in the right market for the brand that you represent, that's a risk to you that's going to affect your multiple. So what can you do about it? What can you do to affect these multiples? First off, our suggestion would be to know what your metrics are and keep track of them. This is not a process that you would want to undertake if you decide, well, I want to sell and I want to sell now. It takes some time to make incremental changes to affect changes in your growth or your profitability prospects, and to affect the risk that others will see, your potential buyers of your dealership will see in your business. So you need to know those metrics, you need to track those metrics, you need to evaluate those trends and evaluate anomalies in those trends to figure out and to identify what's happening. Also, take a look at your strengths and weaknesses and the opportunities and threats that you face, and do that on a regular basis, because that could change over time. A year ago, tariffs weren't really, well, other than President Trump campaigning on the issue, that wouldn't have been something that was really on the radar screen too much at that point. But then now, a year later, it's front and center. So, keep track of those things, update those regularly, look at where your dealership is, and identify what you might be able to do to make positive changes where needed. And be honest with yourself. Don't look at those multiples and blindly think this is what I'm going to get when I sell my dealership, because there's a lot, as you can see, there's a lot that goes into it. And somebody that's looking at buying your dealership might have a different perception than you do. So you want to be honest with yourself. Control the controllable. Again, going back to the metrics, you want to take a look at those. If you find in those metrics that your performance in your service department is not up to standard, why is that? Identify why that is and what can you do to make it better. It might be a matter of, your hiring policies or training your employees, or it might be an advertising and a sale kind of issue. It might go back to, and there's any number of factors that it might go back to. And you want to make incremental, sustainable changes. You're not going to be able necessarily to make changes overnight that are going to change a buyer's perception of your dealership, because they're going to look at it from a due diligence perspective. If they're doing their job, they're going to look at it over a course of time and evaluate whether the changes that are making that or the numbers that you have produced to them are sustainable. And they'll make their own evaluation of whether, how that affects what they're willing to spend in their purchase transaction, or if they're willing to go forward with it. Plan for the uncontrollable as much as you can. I mean, there's and it's, I can't sit here and say you should do this necessarily, because that's each individual dealership is going to have a different formula based on their particular facts and circumstances. But, it goes back to evaluating your strengths and weaknesses and the opportunities and where the threats are. once you identify those, what can you do to mitigate the risk associated with those issues or those factors? Can you go to the next slide? Evaluate the condition of your facilities. One of the 7 factors was that, your facilities, and if you're not image compliant, there's a cost benefit analysis that may be necessary there to say, what's it going to cost me to make the improvements that are going to make me desirable to a buyer, and is it feasible first, and is it worth it? Am I going to get bang for my buck, or do I just realize that, it's going to affect what a buyer is going to pay and really affect that multiple or drive that multiple down because of, a non-image compliant facility, or one that needs other kinds of major improvements. And then, clean up the accounting, do your reconciliations, look at what write-offs and write-downs are going to be necessary or should be done, and look at your reserves, and, that's something that a buyer is going to do when they're doing their due diligence. But if you're doing it on the front end, one, it paints a picture that you are taking care of business, you're operating in an appropriate manner. They're not going to have to come in and make wholesale changes or make a lot of adjustments and things like that. It gives them comfort that they're getting numbers that are the right numbers or the appropriate numbers as a basis for their evaluation. And it gives you the right numbers to be able to evaluate what your expectations might be. Let me ask, are there any questions at this point? Because I know we have some time left.
I have a question.
Yes.
I have questions for Gabe too, but you mentioned evaluating strengths and weaknesses on a regular basis. So what role does a CPA play in that, or can they play in it? And can you give us any examples of how Rosenfield Co. has done that with a dealer and maybe found a weakness that they could fix?
Well, I'll say it from my perspective as a valuation guy, in any valuation I'm doing, whether it's for a car dealership or a restaurant or anything, I look at what the strengths and weaknesses of the business are and what threats and opportunities and threats they face, for the purpose of evaluating what future expectations are. And that's the whole process of that. The value, again, going back to the value is based on future expectations. It's not based on what's happened in the past. The past can be a kind of a guideline to see, how you've responded to different events that may have happened, like the pandemic, the chip shortage, et cetera, and how your response compared to the market. But really, when we're valuing a business, we're looking at what the future expectations are. So we would sit down with management and go through this process of identifying what the strengths and the weaknesses are. We have, an idea sometimes going in, as to particularly what the opportunities and threats are. You'd be looking at, the tariff situation. You'd be looking at the EV, what your position is in the EV market and kinds of things like that. We'd be but really the dealers, they know their business, to a greater depth than we would know it coming in from the outside. we have more of a general knowledge of what, I guess we go in with the expectation of what we might find. And then after that conversation with management, we find out what the real story is, kind of thing. So,
Interesting.
and I think our value would be in helping them to focus and take the time to sit down and actually look at it. Because a lot of dealers are busy with the day-to-day and things like that. They might not necessarily be looking at, you know, what the issues are and how they might plan for or to deal with those. Um, they might be stuck in the weeds dealing with the day-to-day issues. I guess a good example of that would be potentially, you know, how does your used car or your used vehicle inventory and sales operation work? Because there's somewhat of a trickle down, you know, with what's happening in the economy and things like that. If new car prices, like for instance, in the 21, 22, 23 area, when new car prices were going up, it drove a lot of people toward looking at, you know, getting into more affordable used vehicles. We had a case where a dealer, in response to that, went out and stocked up on used vehicles, but they stocked up on used vehicles at a high price because that's what the market was bearing. And then when things started to moderate some, they found they were holding a lot of used inventory that they had to get rid of because they were paying, you know, their floor plan on it. And so they had to discount their prices to get those off the lot, and ended up, you know, detracting from their profitability. So, you know, a lot of that you can control. You want to identify what you can control and what you can't control, and look at and try to make intelligent decisions about where you go and what strategy you take, you know, just based on your best estimate of what's going to happen in the future. It's not a crystal ball. You know, there are certainly, quote unquote, there's risk involved in it. So
So, you know,
it's a balancing act.
I have a couple more questions, but I should give a chance to our other participants. Anybody else have a question?
I think we have a shy audience today, Alicia.
Okay, then, so Gabe, in your presentation, you talked about, or maybe it was when we were talking before this, how if a buyer is looking at a dealership, if they see something that they can really improve on, then they might be willing to pay more for it. On the other hand, Paul's just said, look for your weaknesses. So, you know, maybe their fixed ops isn't very good, so they want to improve that, or their used car operations. But if they don't improve on it, might they be able to sell it for more? I mean, how do you balance that? Okay, the potential buyer sees room for improvement, so they're willing to pay more, versus a seller wanting to improve something so it seems more marketable. Do you see what I'm saying here?
Yeah, absolutely. So our first factor when adjusting a blue sky multiple is that earnings growth expectation. So you're absolutely right, Alicia, that if you are an underperforming store, but you have some of those other really strong factors, you're in a great geography, you're in a truck market in Texas, for example, but you're underperforming, that just because you're underperforming doesn't mean you're going to end up with a average multiple, right? So the idea is that if a buyer believes there is significant growth for them in the future, they will pay more because they know that they will make significantly more than you're earning today. So absolutely right. You know, Paul makes some good comments, but yes, Alicia, that's our first factor in our analysis is, you know, are you underperforming or are you overperforming? Do buyers believe they can do significantly more? We certainly have had occasions where we're selling a domestic franchise for, north of 10 multiple on current earnings. Well, it's usually there's a driver there, and it's usually underperformance.
Interesting. And then I know
Alicia,
you mentioned.
Alicia, sorry, can I add to that?
Sure.
I think it needs to be understood, there are two factors in the calculation of blue sky. There's the income or the economic benefit measure, and then there's the blue sky multiple. So if you had a dealership, for instance, that had, and I'm going to use nice round numbers, $1 million of adjusted income, and it was underperforming. So let's say it's going to go to the high end of the factors, all else being equal. And let's say that factor is 5. 1 million times 5 would be 5 million. That would be blue sky. If they were able to make improvements in their processes and their income goes up to 2 million, but it drops them to the bottom of the metric because they're an overperforming store now, but 2 million times 4 is 8 million. So your blue sky, your overall number, the dollar goes up while the multiple, while the multiple goes down.
Oh, thanks. Any response to that, Gabe? If not,
No, I
have
think
another
that
question.
sounds right. All else being equal, if you have the same story and it's losing money, and there's another one that's the same, and there's no two exact same stores, but it's profitable and it's making money, of course, there's less work to do there on getting it to where it needs to be. So you should expect that if you're a performing store, absolutely, you should be getting a full value. We're just noting that the first adjustment to the multiple is the expectations for earnings growth. And I agree with Paul's sentiment. I don't know about the specific numbers in the example, but yes, I understand.
Yeah. Also, anybody else have a question? Okay, I have another question. And this is a little bit self-interested because I'm working on something for another of my jobs that looks at first-time buyers, first-time dealer principals. So maybe you're a GSM and you're buying your first dealership, or you have a used car operation, but you've never owned a new car franchise. You mentioned that the operator is very important, right? And if you've got a good operator coming in, I guess, then talk to me about the role of the operator in that in valuing the store. Like, is that just one of those equations? Yeah, just talk to me a little about the role of the operator. If a really good operator who has a history of running new car dealerships very well is buying, what does that do? And also, if you don't have a history, how does that impact the whole valuation, or does it?
So Alicia, just to clarify, so your question you're posing is, if the buyer is a good operator buying an asset, is that your question? How does that impact the?
Yes.
So again, it goes to the same comment where if you're a very strong operator and you have the confidence that you can bring a target acquisition up to a certain level, you're already pricing that into your own return model and saying, hey, I know that the store is underperforming today, but as soon as I take over in 6 months, I'm going to be firing on all 8 cylinders here, and I can therefore pay a higher multiple on the current earnings because the current earnings are less relevant to me. I'm more concerned about what I will be doing with this store. So the confidence of the operator can absolutely play a factor to driving up that valuation. On the flip side, there's a rare occasion where you have a phenomenal operator as a seller, and they might be operating at 8-9% net to sales. How does a buyer look at that and say, can I continue, performing to that level? And if they don't believe they can continue performing to that level, that earnings growth expectation, there's an up arrow and a down arrow. So if they believe that the earnings might decline in the future for some reason, then there's an argument to be applying a lower multiple to that.
Okay. And I guess it's the same if you're a first-time operator. If you think you can improve the dealership's value performance significantly, then you're willing to pay more. So yeah, I thank you. All right, I'm leaving it
They're
open for other
looking,
questions.
the
Oh,
buyer
go
is
ahead,
looking
Paul.
into future expectations.
Right. That makes sense. My last question, tariffs. So, I was something that hadn't even occurred to me, and is you mentioned that tariffs have really increased construction cost, which obviously makes sense, right? Because we've got big tariffs on building materials and et cetera. So, given the what's the word I want? Given the capricious nature of tariffs in our current environment, how do you figure that in?
I think our point here was that tariffs have increased construction costs, which make uh, image compliance programs or new facility builds just even that much more expensive. And frankly, there's a lot of uncertainty regarding, how sticky those tariffs are. I think that's where you're headed. But
Yeah.
that question mark is what makes a dealership, frankly, arguably less valuable because they know it's a buyer knows that they're going to need to make an improvement into the facility, but they're not exactly sure what it's really going to end up costing them versus a dealership that's already image compliant. That's already done. It's factored into the appraised value, and they can rely on that and not have to be disrupted operationally or are disrupted financially, especially with a potentially moving target. But the trend is that construction costs are on the rise, and that's been a trend for some time now, and further exacerbated by the impact of tariffs on construction.
So do you ever advise, oh wait, you're sell side, but yeah, do you ever advise a client to go ahead and do that image compliance upgrade before they go to market just because they'll get more for the dealership?
So first of all, I'll mention one thing. You had said that we're sell side. I will clarify for the audience. So we are the only firm that only represents sellers, right? So that we're always representing sellers. We don't represent buyers, and there's no other firm in the industry that does that. And we can have a whole discussion as to why we do that, but ultimately is because our interests are 100% fully aligned with our clients to maximize value of their business. We would not say go ahead and start your image compliant program that may not result in you increasing any profitability, right? We often hear that is from dealers is I'm not going to sell a single more car. I may not make more money. Maybe the P&L is going to look worse because of the increased rent expense that would be attributed to that. So the answer would be no, we would not. But when we see an opportunity, we have a large deal, closing before the end of the year, and all the facilities are image compliant, and we're able to get a real premium on that business because they're already compliant. But no, Alicia, I don't think that if someone came to us and we would give them that advice to go ahead and spend this money with the unknown on how much they're going to recoup in the future.
Cool. Come on, somebody else must have a question. You've all stayed
I
on the whole time.
actually would like to hear some real world stories or examples if you guys have anything to share. Paul, I know earlier you mentioned the importance of making sure all of your contracts and agreements, important documents are in a safe place. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. I was telling about an instance where, and this is actually a litigation case that it's related to a fire that occurred at a dealership in which all of their records were destroyed. Their facility was destroyed. Their computers were all burned up, everything. So they lost most, if not all, of their important documents in that process. So that was one of the things that it was another slide that was going to be added here, but I didn't actually think we'd have enough time. So it was going to be an add-on to a future mail out. But yeah, I mean, you want to, in the process of preparing for your sale, make sure that you have all of those documents readily available You know, you have signed copies of those. I don't know how many times we get involved in looking at a dealership for their accounting purposes or valuation purposes, and they don't have signed copies of documents, or they can't locate them and things like that. But make sure you have them. Make sure that they're stored in a what I'll call a safe place, whether that is a duplicate copy off-site, you know, or in a fireproof box, or in the cloud somewhere. You know, and probably a good idea to have multiple copies of those things just in case. But you want to make sure that those things are secured somewhere. And that would include, you know, your sales and service agreements, your dealer agreements, your operating agreements, leases, your debt agreements, your title documents, things like that. Everything that when somebody's coming in to buy your dealership, they're going to ask for all of that. So, you know, have that handy, keep it somewhere where you can get to it, you know, readily, and make sure that it's safeguarded.
Thank you. Gabe, did you want to add
Sorry.
anything? Maybe you have a successful example, or maybe a not so successful example to share with us?
Certainly on the preparation for sale, there's lots of practical things that dealers should be doing, you know, pulling their parts inventory, understanding how much is obsolete, or potential for obsolete parts. That comes into place even when negotiating, you know, times the LOI, or the contracts. You know, similarly, you know, we see some pitfalls in the service department, and you know, why is this RO still open? And it's, you know, it was opened a year ago or a year and a half ago. So there's a lot of cleanup to be done, particularly in that service department as you prepare for the actual sale. So that would be two practical things that we would suggest is just going through and looking at your parts inventory, and then factoring that into your negotiation, you know, with a buyer.
So, you know, how far ahead, if I'm preparing to sell my dealership, how far ahead should I start preparing? Or if I'm thinking of selling my dealership, how far ahead do you think I should start preparing?
So, you know, many clients reach out to us when they've made the decision that now's the time that they want to execute, and we get on it right away. It's a lengthy process from the time that you've made that decision to the time of closing, is the reality. There is a period to get prepared to go to market. We spend significant time on the front end before we would even go to market. Let's say about a month's time. And then you are negotiating contracts, then ultimately submitting to the OEM, which it's at least a 60-day process to get approval through that. So it is about a 6-month process. And I think that for some of the things that I mentioned, that's certainly ample time to clean that up. But oftentimes they don't even know the question. They don't know the answer to that. You know, how much obsolete parts do you have? Because the buyer is offering you 10 cents on the dollar in the contract. Yeah, what's the hit to you? And it can take some time to clean through that. So you do have some time from when you've made the decision, you've hired a firm like ours, you know, until the closing. I think Paul
And
has a question.
I would say today, you know, because the things that we would recommend, you know, that, you know, looking at your metrics and things like that, those should be things that you're doing continuously, you know, because you're always looking to improve your dealership, I would hope, you know, and those are the things that you need to do those are the things that are going to pay dividends when it's time to sell, whether that's a year from now, 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, you know, because those are things that they're going to improve the efficiency of your operations. And you never know when necessarily when the need to sell might come up, you know, because their life happens kind of thing. So.
Cool. Thanks so much, guys. Now, participants, Come on, somebody ask at least one question. Otherwise, we'll think you're all not listening. Although I know you did.
I can ask
Well,
Gabe a question. Gabe, since we have a few minutes here, Gabe, in the beginning, you had said that the blue sky is a function of the adjusted pre-tax income times the multiple. Well, what is adjusted pre-tax income? What, because I have seen it with different things being added back and whatnot. So there's no set formula for that. But I guess in your experience, what are the kind of things that are getting added back?
sure. And there's certainly a whole session to talk about adjusted, income, but I'm happy to highlight a couple. So one of the largest adjustments to earnings that we see is a rent adjustment, a fair market value rent adjustment. So as we know, many dealers own the real estate and they might own it in a separate entity, or in the case of Florida, they might own it in the same entity as the operations. So just applying an adjustment so that you're charging market rent based on today's appraised value. So you're not just using whatever you've been charging historically. You're adjusting it. We're today using about a 7% cap rate on appraised real estate value. So that's the kind of a major one. The other one that is usually very high on the list is going to be owner's compensation if the owner is not performing the role of the general manager. So that is a typical adjustment to earnings. And there are several others, one-time items, right? So that it could be a number of things. Charitable contributions, certainly we see that as well. Many of our clients have significant charitable contributions, and some are running on the statement, and we'll need to pull those out. So, and add that back as an example. So there's a lot to go over on adjusted earnings, but hopefully that's just, some of the high level typical adjusted earnings.
Yeah, and that's consistent with what we would see. I think it's important to point those out because, like, for instance, the rent, if you're charging, higher than market rent to pull that out into, a separate company, that lowers the pre-tax income of the dealership, but, your buyer is not going to, they're not going to be paying that amount. So you would want to make sure that you adjust that to a market rate of rent. The same thing with the owner's compensation. It's if you are actually working in the business, then that's a legitimate expense to have at market rates for the services you provide. But if you are largely not working in the business and all the money that you're taking out as compensation is really, there's not commensurate value for what you're doing for the business, or not what a buyer is going to spend on that work, then that needs to be adjusted or should be adjusted.
No question. And I just highlighted some of the major ones that we see. There obviously are other specific circumstances, but those would be our largest ones that we see. I also would say that just the integrity of the numbers that you're starting off with, right? So making sure that you do have an expert involved in preparing those that adjusted earnings. So you can't just take your 12-month statement and start there, understanding were there any year-end adjustments applied? Were they for tax purposes or not? So there's some significant accounting, heavy lifting to make sure that the integrity of the numbers that you're starting with is where you should be starting.
So we have a little bit more time, and since I always have a question, I know, Gabe, that y'all are coming out with a new Blue Sky report, and you can't reveal anything specific about it, but I'm going to throw you a sort of a softball question here. But if I'm looking to, if I want to sell my dealership, do you think this year, the next quarter, is a good time to do that? What's the market going to look like for the end of this year?
So we don't, I'll tell you that when we look at the last few years, it's pretty clear that 24 was an earnings trough. So that's what the publics have experienced, which is probably the best data that's out there. So now that profitability is on an up, on a rise, we do see
Right.
valuations rising. So that is a good environment to sell into when a buyer can really project out, future growth. So
Right.
that's what I would say. There's obviously no crystal ball, but it's a good environment to sell into when earnings are on the rise.
Do you see that continuing into 2026? Earnings continue to rise?
We do. We don't see anything that, we don't see anything that would indicate otherwise. So there's obviously some more winners and losers on the franchise side,
Right.
as the business has normalized and become a more operational business. So that's what I would say is certainly some brands are going to have a rockier road. We talked about, some of the German brands that are going to continue to struggle. And some of the domestics are really strong, and some are getting better. I know Stellantis was in a really low place last year. It's in a better place today. It doesn't mean that it's a high demand franchise, but it has improved drastically. So there's some more winners and losers in a normal retail environment like we're in today, and I think that also some of the things we discussed earlier with Toyota and Lexus, and why are they still at the top, and why could Lexus be even stronger? It's because they've had that discipline with their inventory. They've had that discipline with their growth of their dealer network. So absolutely, we think that next year will continue to be a great year for profitability and for the M&A business.
Great. Well, I certainly enjoyed this because I've gotten to ask all kinds of questions that I was interested in. We still have time. Anybody else? No? Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Kathy.
Thank you. Thank you all again. Thank you again to our speakers, Gabe, Robleto, and Paul Dumm, for sharing your insights. And thank you to everyone who joined us today, especially if you're still here through the very end. We hope this conversation helped you think about new ways to strengthen your dealership's value and prepare you for when you're ready to sell. And if you want to keep the conversation going, please reach out to us. I have contact information for our speakers on the screen. And I'd love to hear any topics that you'd like to hear about in the future. Also, a recording of today's session and the slide deck that will be published on our website soon, so keep an eye out for that. And thank you again. Hope you all enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you at our next webinar, which is actually going to be on post-acquisition success. So that'll be an interesting one as well. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us, Kathy. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Okay. Bye.